Welcome to Connection Academy podcast, a series of conversations on what success might look like in a truly connected world. One where we have a better understanding of ourselves, each other, and the endless possibilities of life around us. I'm your host, Kristen Ransom. On today's episode, we speak with Ian Power, who is the CEO of spunout.ie, Ireland's youth information website, inclusive of a free 24/7 text service called 50808, which provides support for people going through mental health or emotional crisis, big or small. Ian and I had an incredibly rich conversation on the very important topic of creating space for connection and practical ways in which we can use emotional intelligence to foster more inclusive spaces.
You need to feel like you are a fully equal member of society in order to be able to feel like you belong. People are celebrated because they've been part of the community, because they've been caring, because they've been empathetic, because they've done something for others, because they've seen the bigger picture and they've connected to the larger mission. If you can try to approach things from a source of empathy, it's ultimately going to result in much better outcomes no matter what the situation. You're never going to be able to bash down the walls of ignorance or intolerance or hate entirely, but I think that it's really important that you try. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. It's so much about you as an individual and the work you need to do on yourself.
This episode is part of a larger series of conversations discussing mental health and well-being. Science has shown that connection aids our mental health in many different ways, reducing our levels of anxiety and depression, regulating our emotions, and improving our self-esteem. But beyond mental health, another reason why I felt this episode was contextually relevant is because if you look at many of the global news headlines, whether that be on racial injustice, growing inequality, or grossly skewed political views, they all emphasize fragmentation and disconnection within our communities. This conversation addresses practical ways we might better come to understand one another, so that we may evolve as a human collective. With that being said, enjoy today's conversation. Yeah, the word empathy comes up so often in these conversations, so maybe we could just actually unpack that a little bit further. It's always an interesting one because even in the workplace, speaking about empathy towards our colleagues, towards our clients, in personal relationships, it comes up a lot. But specifically when it comes to trying to connect with and understand the perspective of someone who might have a totally different lived experience to your own, that's where empathy is so crucial. Maybe if you could give us a bit of a definition of what empathy means to you and how you believe it can be used as a tool to foster a deeper sense of connection.
For me, empathy is about listening. It's about being non-judgmental. It's about coming to something with a sense of humility that you don't know anything and you need to better understand what that person is going through in order to be able to support them. Ultimately, it's not really about forming a judgment. It's about forming an understanding. And I think so often we kind of jump 2 feet into a situation without pausing to really listen or to think or to even consider. And I think you see loads of situations where people are maybe lashing out, where people are, behaving badly. And I think sometimes our first response is to condemn and to kind of make a snap judgment, as opposed to kind of stepping back and thinking, well, maybe is there something going on in this person's life that's causing them to behave in this way? And I think if you can try to approach things from a source of empathy, it's going to result in much better outcomes no matter what the situation. That's always easier said than done. And we're all human and we all have, experiences, and maybe we're going through things at different times and maybe our temper or our patience is tested. That's human. And I don't think we can all be perfect all of the time, but I think if we can try and root ourselves in an empathetic approach to things, no matter what the situation, I think it always produces a positive outcome to a certain degree. I mean, you're never going to be able to kind of bash down the walls of ignorance or intolerance or hate entirely. But I think that it's really important that you try and you come from that place as much as possible. I think there's really huge progress that can be made, as I say, over time, you know.
I want to go a little bit deeper into this. Often when we speak about being empathetic, it sounds so simple, but as you've even said, it's sometimes is a lot harder in practice. Some tips and tricks that I've learned and I've tried to practice myself, one of them is practicing curiosity. And I think, as you said there, is trying to understand why someone might be behaving in a certain way or having a particular perspective, and entering into any relationship assuming that you've got something to learn. I think that's often something that we get tripped up on when we enter into a space, trying to fit the information in that space into our current box of how we have experienced life. Just quite curious in terms of how or what your advice is in terms of entering into a space with curiosity and really just creating that space to learn from one another.
I think that ultimately, I think curiosity and empathy go hand in hand. I think that's absolutely correct. And I think it's a really lovely, harmonious, complementary set of values to live your life by. But I think it's very difficult to come at that if there's a level of insecurity or if there's lack of self-awareness perhaps in yourself. And so I think ultimately, in order to be able to kind of come at it from that approach in the very first instance, I think we have to sit with ourselves and understand ourselves really very carefully. In order to do that, I think we have to be kind to ourselves. We have to practice self-empathy first of all, right? So we have to kind of come to terms with who we are. We have to come to terms with, the situations we find ourselves in. And we have to try to, in respect of who we are, I think we have to love ourselves in order to kind of get to the point where we can be in conversations with others and not feel the need for it to be about us or to be about you as an individual, but rather that you have the space to be there and to be humble and to be curious about the other person that's sitting in front of you and to give them your time and to not feel like you're owed anything back. That's really important. It's very difficult. It takes a long time to get to that place. And when you think about your teenage years, so much of it is about comparison. And, we all know that comparison is the thief of joy. And so ultimately, it's trying to get to a place where you are happy enough within yourself and you're accepting enough of yourself and you're kind enough to yourself that you can really get to that place where you can be truly curious, where you can be truly empathetic, and where you can create that space when you're with others to get into that feeling that you're able to open up a space where people can open up to you and talk to you about what's going on for them. So I think ultimately it's so much about you as an individual and the work you need to do on yourself before we can ever get to that point. And that's why I'm always mindful of when you're in a situation where there is clearly a person who can't reach for that empathy, that clearly there's a lot of work to be done there, and that's for that person to do, and nobody's going to be able to make that person do that. But it's just to be mindful of that, because I think ultimately you can kind of come at it with a better understanding, and also as well for yourself, you can rationalize it more, and you can kind of, I guess, try to understand what might drive somebody to act in a way that maybe is intolerant of others, or maybe hurtful of others, or maybe even just not even considerate of others, something on a very basic level where there may be love between two people or a group of people, but it's just not at the level where it's really about care, I think, and that it actually is truly caring for those around you. So, I mean, it's really tough. I think it requires us to do a lot of soul searching, and sometimes that's not fun, and sometimes you're just trying to completely move the opposite direction and forget all about that. But I think if we can do that at all, I think that's definitely something that's going to serve us well. It's going to serve us well as individuals, but it's also going to make us better people and better friends and better family.
You've touched on such an incredibly important point. We're chatting about connection, which is largely rooted on our need for love and belonging. And this is an emotional need at the end of the day. And I think sometimes it's quite easy for us to neglect, well, we're chatting about an emotional need. How might we use our emotional intelligence to address this emotional need? And I'm actually currently reading a book by Daniel Goleman. He's got such great literature on the topic, and he speaks about the 5 pillars of emotional intelligence. And the very first one is self-awareness. Just to go through them: self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills. And I mean, we've just been speaking about the role of empathy, but empathy kind of ties into so many of those others. But as you were saying, if you haven't done some soul searching to start and you don't have that level of self-awareness, it's difficult to lean into the space of empathy and take on someone else's battles when you have a certain state of chaos within yourself. So I definitely think that there's so much space for us to learn a bit more about emotional intelligence and how we can harness these emotional skills in the spaces where we are hoping to develop a deeper sense of connection.
Absolutely. And I think the only way really to do that is through practice. I think the more kind of social interaction, the more social connections that we can get into our lives, I think the more you're going to become a natural at being an emotionally intelligent person. There's so many things that are rooted in emotional intelligence that are fundamental to being able to understand the human condition and to try to get to a place where, whether it's in work, whether it's at home, whether it's with friends, that you're able to understand the dynamics that are going on and that are at play, and to try to be as good a support as you can be, and to try to be as productive as you can be, and all of those different things. Everyone's so familiar with the concept of IQ, and very few people actually know the concept of EQ. It's kind of become a buzzword in the last few years, and it's kind of become something that people are talking a bit more about. But ultimately, in order to be emotionally intelligent, you have to have that self-awareness. That's the foundation. You need to know your strengths. I think you need to know your weaknesses. You need to be either at peace with your weaknesses or doing things that are kind to yourself, that are working towards improving in that space, and to try to make baby steps towards being, whether it's being a better person in a respect, or whether it's being more accepting of yourself in a particular way. It's really important that we're focusing on ourselves, that we're understanding, and not too much as well, because I think that's where you stray into really difficult territory and terrain. I think it's when we're too self-aware to the point where we're self-critical, and I think you have to try to avoid letting yourself get into that space. If you can understand where you think your strengths are, being humble about those strengths. I think if you can understand where your weaknesses lie and accept them, and to be comfortable within yourself, I think that that's a really strong foundation from which to be able to build up on the other pillars. And ultimately, that's how it's connected to empathy. It's also really connected to motivation as well, because I think if you are very clearly self-aware as to where you fit in the world, who you are, what your purpose is in life, it's going to help you to kind of be motivated to do the things that you want to do in life. And I think ultimately, the more work we can do on ourselves to become self-aware, the more we're going to be in a position to be successful, or to be a good friend, or to be a good family member. So I think it's really important that we can try to spend time doing that. And I think you can very clearly see those people around you who have not spent the time, looking inward. You can very clearly see how overlooking that element of yourself and that sense of self is what will let you down in those other areas of your life. And I think ultimately, in order to kind of get to that space where you're in a position to be able to come to situations with empathy, you really do have to try to do that work. And there's no substitute for it. You can't really get away from it. There's no quick way to do it. There's no test you can do. It's really that straightforward, that it's hard work and you got to do it yourself.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that point. And you can definitely pick up when someone hasn't spent time getting to know themselves. And one of the telltales of that is when somebody's quite reactive. A way that I've come to understand this in terms of what is self-awareness, it's extending the gap between stimulus and response. And the larger we can make that gap, the more information we can take in to respond and rather not react. So as you've said, I think coming to know your strengths, your weaknesses, but also perhaps some of your biases. Where have you grown up? What is your culture? What is your racial group? What is your sexual preference? And all of these really important points that human beings clash on so much. How has that shaped the way that you might be reacting rather than responding to other people? And is that in fact severing connection, or is it aiding it?
I think it's such a fundamental point, really. I think what that's about is difference. And an intolerance for a difference really is a beacon for somebody who has work to do in terms of their self-awareness and their self-acceptance and their solidity and their security in themselves and who they are. And I think ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a situation whereby young people, as we grow, we're learning to understand the people around us, what people have been through in comparison to maybe what you've been through, and to be able to understand that we have different sets of privileges, and that's part of the conversation as well. And what's interesting about what's going on as conversations right now is that those with the most privilege over the past centuries are being challenged to, be more empathetic towards those without the same privileges. Ultimately, that's about power, and ultimately that's why people feel so threatened. That's connected, though, to people's ability to be self-aware. And it's in those interactions that you can very clearly see the gap between stimulus and response is very, very thin. And you only have to look at straight white male Twitter to kind of understand that, right? And that's not to generalize, but it's to try to force ourselves always to understand that really we've had it so good in many ways. And there are generations of privilege that have kind of embedded over time where that level of surety and that level of kind of confidence in your place in the world is not up for question. And so what's really interesting is that as soon as somebody else maybe who has not felt that way and does not feel that way asserts their right to feel that way, that threatens you and your identity. I think, the base upon which you've built yourself has been solely on a kind of a systemic structure as opposed to one of individual identity. And I think that means that there's so much work to be done there in trying to become comfortable with oneself as opposed to relying on some sort of societal marker that allows you to feel comfortable in yourself. And it's just really challenging. And I can understand, I can understand exactly why someone might feel threatened because their roots are being somewhat challenged. And the only thing is that I just regret so much those who can't see it as an opportunity to become, an even better version of oneself, and to know people when their lives are celebrated. They're not celebrated for being individualistic or for having loads of different things or to having done very well on their own. People are celebrated because they've been part of a community, because they've been caring, because they've been empathetic, because they've done something for others, because they've seen the bigger picture and they've connected to the larger mission. And I think that that's really ultimately what we're all trying to do. And you can lead a horse to water in many respects, and you can demonstrate this on a daily basis, and you can be empathetic, but sometimes people just won't respond. And some people unfortunately go through life and they don't ever connect with that. And I just think it's such a missed opportunity for that person. And I don't feel angry or I don't feel critical of that person, but I kind of feel more just sad, because I think that that's a person who's gone through life where they've not really leveled up to that place where really they're trying to be the best version of themselves for themselves, but also for others around them too.
So much in there that I want to unpack. Yeah, I think just to go back to our need for love and belonging, I actually have a quote here by Brené Brown, who has inspired me so deeply. And just for people that don't know her, she's a professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work, and she has specialized in social connection. And she says here, a deep sense of love and belonging is an irresistible need of all people. We are biologically, cognitively, physically, and spiritually wired to love, to be loved, and to belong. And when those needs are not met, we don't function as we are meant to. And I think that last sentence, that we don't function the way that we're meant to when we don't have this sense of love and belonging, or when we don't have this sense of connection, that's so crucial in terms of why we need to be having this conversation. And you touched on such an important point there, saying that sometimes when we are exposed to a perspective or an experience of life that is so fundamentally different to ourselves, it can make us feel a bit threatened, because it can feel like the ground beneath you and that you've rooted your identity on can seemingly feel like it's crumbling away, and that makes us feel really threatened. But I mean, if we're speaking about creating space for connection, you mentioned there that it's such a pity that people don't see that as a space for curiosity and to grow and to learn and to come together as a collective, rather than segmenting and fragmenting off into our own little groups and create these feedback loops of our egos. And we definitely have our work cut out for us in this space. I mean, it's easy to speak about these topics. It's a whole separate ballgame to actually engage on these very heavy topics that divide us, such as race. That's been such a big part of the conversation happening all over the world. But it's such an amazing thing that we can really come together on and celebrate our differences, rather than say, hey, we have to be the same if we are to get on. I mean, this is really something that inspires me a lot to have this conversation. And it's also something that makes me feel a bit nervous inside, because I can definitely feel that there's so much work ahead of us in terms of what this road ahead looks like, in terms of really creating space for connection in our friend groups, in our families, in our communities, at work, and so on.
For me, what's crucial is that in terms of people maybe who go through life and don't have an opportunity to kind of open up and to think about things in a different way, I think what we can do is we can try to provide those opportunities for learning for people around us who maybe are not connected to that sense of self-learning or self-awareness, or kind of the openness to kind of understanding difference and what others are going through, and to build those building blocks for empathy. And I think really that's what we have to be trying to doing, not on Twitter, not with people necessarily. I don't think there's anything such thing as a lost cause or anything like that. So I don't think we should give up on anybody either. But I think we should be looking for those that might be open to it, but just have not had the opportunity to explore and to try to understand difference. And I think you talked about Brené's quote in respect of being built to love, needing to be loved, and needing to belong as well. And I think there's a couple of different things there. And number one, if you think about those that are causing harm or causing hate, generally speaking, you can often find instances in their experiences where they've not received the love they deserve to receive. And that's one thing we can try to do. And I think, when we talk to young people about bullying, we often try to get the victims of bullying to understand that this isn't necessarily anything about you. Yes, they have latched on to something that makes you different in order to try to pull you back down, but ultimately this is about how they're feeling, and that they're lacking in some way something that they need, and to try to help the victims understand that that's where it's coming from, and to try to make them feel better and less targeted. Then the other side of things is that people need to feel like they belong. And so when you think about the LGBTI community, if you think about the Black community, you need to feel like you are a fully equal member of society in order to be able to feel like you belong, that your worth is the same as everybody else's, that you're treated the same way in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the state, and in the eyes of your neighbor. And I think that that's fundamentally so crucial to our understanding of ourselves, and crucial to us being happy. So I think there's a lot packed up in those three ideas, and they're the root cause of why so many things in respect of difference causes such division, causes such animosity, and causes such difficulty. And I think there's the three tools, or the three principles, that we can understand and try to apply in as much as we possibly can to be able to try to tackle it. I often think of the MLK quote, like darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And so it seems counterintuitive in many instances to come at something, you think like for like, as opposed to opposite to opposite. And I think that's really what we have to be trying to do. And it's really difficult. It's not easy. And I think only those that have the greatest capacity for it can kind of really tell us how to do it. But I think it's what we all need to be trying to do as much as we can.
I also just want to touch a little bit deeper on human connection itself. And I read a quote, and it said here that human connection is simply an energy exchange between two people or multiple people who are paying attention to one another. And again, it's easy to simplify these things and make them sound really easy, but that in and of itself, especially in today's context, is quite difficult. And when I say it's difficult, the main word that stood out there was paying attention. If we are to truly foster space for connection, we need to learn to pay attention to one another. Maybe if you could share a bit more about what is your perspective on what this means in terms of us creating space for connection.
I think ultimately it's about listening, about creating that space to hear what other people are saying and being present and being in the space, ready to hear, ready to digest and to understand, and not necessarily respond. So I think often we are very quick to respond. We're very quick to share our perspective, our 2 cents, whereas that's not really what it's about. I think it's about trying to ask questions. It's to be curious. It's to understand. We can only get to the places that we need to get to if we're, open to doing that, and if we create the space to do that.
Then I guess the second question onto that, because you work with the youth and, if we're having a conversation about the future generations, the youth are spending so much time online. And I'm wondering how this is affecting people's ability to pay true attention to each other. I mean, we speak about paying true attention then means really listening, active listening, not being distracted, being present, having a sense of curiosity. And I just wonder, are we creating a space where we are nurturing that skill in the youth, or is the technology that we are providing being counteractive to that?
I think there's 2 ways to look at it. The passive scrolling, the passive kind of consumption has huge propensity to distract and to act as a barrier to that level of connection and that level of understanding. The other side of it is that we can see from the research that actually people who spend time engaging with others online, who spend time understanding, talking, actually it's a protective factor for your mental health, and actually it's a positive thing. And so it really kind of depends on the use case, the intention, the attention that we pay to what's going on. And I think that we often, unfortunately, we slip into that passive mode and we slip into consumption, and we don't necessarily always think about how we can be most present. And, it's around us everywhere, whether you're at home and you're not paying attention to what somebody's saying to you, or, the opportunity to have a really meaningful conversation or connection. Friends at dinner, you often see it in restaurants, people who, are clearly seeing each other for the first time in a while, but they're suddenly and somehow stuck in their phone screens. And so I think, what we're always trying to talk to young people about is mindful intention, and to create those spaces where you're not leaving something else take over kind of what is the overall purpose of our connections with others. And it's a challenge. I think it's something that we're all grappling with. I think it's something that we all need to remind ourselves of what we can do. And I think it's just something that we all struggle with for our own well-being, generally speaking. I think I really encourage and recommend people to, do a regular digital detox and digital cleanse. And it's such a buzzword, but I think it's about understanding how you best want to spend your time and understanding who do I want to be engaging with on the various platforms when I'm on the various platforms. Who do I want to make sure that I'm not ignoring in person, and how can I better control what I'm doing when I'm around others? How can I create space for a day for myself in nature, which is just so important to our well-being? All of these different things are so crucial. And so I think we really do have to, be self-aware, think about what these things are doing to us, and how we're living our lives and what quality of life we're having, and really understand the positive and get what you need, but not to overconsume or to over rely on, I think, some of the things that have become crutches for social interaction as opposed to social interaction themselves.
And I think we've almost done a full loop here, coming back to the need for self-awareness, because we're speaking about the importance of living with intention and paying attention to yourself and planning how you spend time, especially your time online. And if you don't have a sense of self-awareness and what matters to you and what kind of perspectives you currently hold and what viewpoints you hold and where you might challenge that, you can get sucked into feedback loops, especially online. So it is very interesting. And I think that the role of emotional intelligence for the youth will be an incredibly important one going forward in this space. I'm thinking about people that might be in a space with other people that is fragmented, whether that be in their homes, in their friendships, perhaps with their colleagues at work. And we're speaking about creating a space for connection. What are some of the practical things we could do today that might set us on the right course?
Communicating with intention is really good in terms of creating spaces for connection. Communicating with a friend that, okay, we've not seen each other in quite a while. I really want to hear what's going on with you. I really just want to sit down and listen to everything that's happening for you, particularly if maybe someone's been having a tough time recently or been finding things really difficult. Letting people know that you really want to hear, I think, is really important. In Ireland, we are very good for asking, how are you, but not really wanting to know the answer. And so I think making sure that the other person knows that you're trying to create that space and that you really want to know and that you care and that all you want to do is listen. You're not trying to interfere or fix. I think that that's a really important thing that we can try and do. And to signal that in advance, I think is really helpful. I think we have to back that up with action. And so when we do create that space for connection, I think we have to make sure that we're there, that we're present, that we're in the moment and that we're not distracted by anything else, and that we're giving of ourselves to that person 100% and in totality for that time. Because ultimately, when you think about it, that person's being really generous in sharing with you and giving you the opportunity to understand or to be in a place where you're learning. And I think, as we've discussed, if you're in a position to create that space for social connection, hopefully you understand the value of it and you understand that actually this is a really generous act on the part of somebody else, as opposed to you being selfless in that scenario. So I think we really have to try to remember that. It's about trying to make ourselves available when we can and understanding self-care as well. I think that's really important. You can't fill from an empty cup. So you kind of have to make sure that you focus on yourself and your self-care in order to be able to be in a position to be there for others as well and to create that social connection. I think as well, it's about trying to understand where people fit in the world, who may be needing more social connection than others as well. And I think about those that have found the last few months more difficult than others, whether that's, older people. So it could be an older relative that lives alone. Maybe it's somebody who has found this period really difficult and has gone through lots of different changes that they need support with. Or maybe you are thinking about somebody who's gone through something that's been really traumatic or really difficult, and it could have been a few years ago, it could have been yesterday, but it's somebody that you keep in your mind to kind of check in on. And one of the things I'd always recommend is kind of keeping a list. I love lists. I don't know about you, but I always keep a list of kind of people in my life that I want to check in with, because life gets really busy. And I think it's really useful every so often to kind of refer back to that list and say, okay, who on this list have I not seen in a while? And who have I not really connected with meaningfully in a while, and to try to do something about that, and to act in a way where you're moving with intention to kind of create that space for social connection. So those are just some of the small things I would suggest, but definitely there's loads of resources out there to kind of get advice and guidance, and, you know, to really try to get onto that journey of self-discovery that allows you to get to a point where you're really firing on all cylinders, and you're really developing that EQ and that emotional intelligence that's going to serve you so well in just so many facets of life. Emotional intelligence has the power to be able to give so much to so many, but also it's a gift to yourself as well. And I think people forget that sometimes.
You're very right. So I think really at the root of all of that, we all have to be a bit more intentional about fostering space for connection and planning it. As you said, I think you mentioned that you're a fan of lists, and I had a big smile on my face as you said that, because every morning I actually sit for 5 minutes and I map out the different areas of my life, whether it being work, relationships, myself, my hobbies, and exactly what my intentions are for the day in each one of those. And sometimes I feel a layer of guilt when I write somebody's name down saying, oh, I must call them. It seems a bit crazy that we have to be so intentional about it, but I think that's how busy we are in this day and age. And I think if that's what it takes, then that's what it takes. And being a bit more intentional about it at least puts the building blocks to actually progressing forward into that space.
Yeah, and I mean, so many people don't do it. So I think we have to be really proud that we've recognized that this is something we want to, you know, prioritize. This is something we think is important, and to put the time and the action behind that. And I think there's so many distractions in life, and, you know, being in a position where you've got that self-awareness to pull yourself away from those distractions and to understand what's really important truly is, there's no way, you know, we can feel shame for that. I think it's really important that we understand that that's us acting in spite of what is potentially natural these days, you know, and we're trying to get to a place where, you know, we're making sure that we're making space. And I think that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, definitely. You're very right. Ian, thanks so much for sharing your perspective on this topic. It's definitely one that has so many avenues we could go down, and I'm excited for all the different conversations to be had on the topic of connection. But you've definitely shared such a rich perspective on how we can go about creating more space for connection. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kristen.
Thanks for joining today's conversation. I know when I finished this interview with Ian, I had a lot going on in my head, particularly on the topic of self-awareness, which, as discussed today, is at the root of our ability to foster empathy and effectively create space for connection. I would encourage you to get to know yourself a little better, as you would do with a friend. Really ask yourself how you are showing up in different areas of your life, and whether the way you present yourself is effective at fostering space for connection. Join me in further episodes in this series discussing topics around well-being. Please remember to subscribe and share episode links with your friends and family. See you next time.